any students that may not be able to join us today. And one other student coming in at the moment. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to have you here with us again today, and very excited to have a couple of military musicians that I really respect and admire. I've known Adrian Holton for, I don't know, since 2006, I think, when we were both at the University of Florida. Fantastic trumpet player. All the trumpet players in the group here should reach out and maybe get a lesson from you or something like that. And he's also a conductor as well, and in the ceremonial brass of the U.S. Air Force Band. And then the Colonel, Tim Holton, I had an opportunity to work with him about 4 years ago in 2016 when I worked with his Army band, Pershing Zone, and it's a delight to have him with us as well. So welcome, gentlemen, and what I'd like to maybe start off with is just talking about some experiences about being a military musician first. Since we talked a lot about score study yesterday, maybe we can put that just a little bit later, and that way we can talk about some of these military careers that you had.
Can I can I
Colonel?
make a
Yeah,
request?
yeah, of course.
I'd like to know who we're meeting with today.
Yeah, of course. So the majority of the students in this class are music ed students. I think there are a couple of performance majors only. Sarah Faltz, is that correct? Yeah. And then everybody else, I believe, is an education major, so they have intentions to be either a future band director or future orchestra director. Some potentially might be doing some other things, like Emily Jones there. She'd like to do some additional stuff, maybe in music therapy. Is that right, Emily? Okay, great. And Shelby, I think we've talked about some of those things as well. So a little bit of variety, and then we have a couple of guests that are joining us, Mary Nowinski and Corey Landon, who are current band directors in the Wisconsin area. And Corey's got a little mustache going on. That's not something new. So, Colonel, why don't we start off with you and maybe kind of share your experience about being a military musician?
Wow. Okay. Um, I guess it started back when I was teaching in Montana. I had used recordings of the military bands as examples of, what a really good band sounds like. And I had had contact with several folks coming through and conducting all states and other honor bands that were associated with the military, and I was always impressed with their bearing and their knowledge, and the fact that they walked in usually having a pretty clear plan. So there was a template laid out for me before I even got the bug about auditioning for a career in military music. Um, and once I decided to audition, my wife and I were both teaching in Montana. Our firstborn was 1, and it was a huge leap of faith because we were an hour from my in-laws, and that was jerking up stakes into some unknown circumstance. And it was a fairly steep learning curve in terms of expectations of how you conduct yourself. The knowledge base hopefully is already there. You just need to adapt it towards the requirements that are expected of you. And I had a real fortunate string of assignments that gave me experience, and I think as much experience about just dealing with people rather than um, gaining a lot of musical knowledge and insight. When I was teaching, I used to talk to the parents at back to school night. I said, I'm not really here to teach music. I'm here to teach life skills. And if I do a good job of helping your sons and daughters learn to be on time, to be respectful, to be sensitive to those around them, to be in the moment, all those kinds of things, guess what? The music's going to be really good too. Um, and I think that, as simplistic as that may sound, it was a similar realization for me in working with professional musicians, and that they're people just like me. They want to be appreciated for what they do and who they are. And when we're working as a tight-knit musical organization, you get to know the families, the kids, the ups and the downs. And so learning to be not only an artistic director, but also an executive director of a musical organization was not unlike what I did as a high school band director. All the bits and pieces that we have to track, I still love to push chairs and stands. But what it allowed me was to raise the bar a little bit in terms of musical expectation and stretch the limits. But I found that really a rewarding thing, because I was able to tap that knowledge base of all of those individuals in the organization to find out what they know about a particular composer or a particular piece. So rather than when I was teaching and having a fully formed concept of what each piece of music should be like, I was now able to be more collaborative and say, oh, I really like what you're doing with that. Let's go with it. So it was an interesting learning curve in trying to find that balance of being respectful of people and their time, because as an officer, I would ask something and people would feel obligated to go find an answer. And I had to be careful that I wasn't sending them down rabbit holes or otherwise wasting their time. So it was an interesting discovery of finding balance in working within the military. And I guess the last thing is I had the good fortune of being able to take advantage of the Army's Training with Industry program, where they send folks out for a year to work in an environment that does something similar and then bring back best practices. So I spent a year in Dallas with the Dallas Winds, and I was the associate director and director of operations. And along with that, a couple of our other officers had done orchestral work, and there's an expectation that you do some private instruction with the artistic director. So I sat down each concert cycle with Jerry Junkin and worked through some things. And after a time of reviewing videotapes and of what I had done before coming to Texas, and then also watching, are you aware of the fact that the Dallas Winds do a fanfare series in the foyer of the Marson Symphony Center before each concert? Well, we started that for me so that he could have something to look at for me in real time conducting, and it continues today. That makes me really happy. So, after we met a few times, he stopped cold and said, so how much does that uniform constrain you? And I said, well, to a degree. People have expectations, and they just would not, they couldn't put their brains around, somebody in uniform doing cartwheels across the front of the stage. So, you have to kind of fit that expectation of what people think of how you conduct yourself, the deportment in uniform. So he said, okay, here's my challenge to you. Conduct music in such a way so as to draw criticism for being too musical. So it was his challenge to push the envelope a little bit and loosen up and be the music rather than some automaton without expression. And I think it changed my approach a bit. I feel a little less constrained today when I'm not wearing a uniform. But that's such a part of me after 28 and a half years in uniform. That's part of who I am, I guess. So, and like those of you who are bonding in your classes and in your ensembles, I think the thing I miss most now about being in the military is the people. I mean, I got to work with great people that were fabulous musicians, but it's that old adage of in the military, in war, you're not fighting for your country, you're fighting for the person next to you in your foxhole. And it's the same thing in any musical organization. And I had the advantage. Most full colonels don't get to know the newest people in the military. There's a lot of people between them in the chain of command. But in the military organization of a band or an orchestra or whatever musical ensemble, you get to know everybody very well and develop a very strong relationship with them, which is a wonderful thing.
Wonderful, Colonel. And you actually auditioned into the military as a conductor, correct?
Yes.
And there are certain organizations where you have to go through as a player first, whereas some of the organizations you can go and just audition for a conducting position.
Yeah, I believe it's only the Army and the Air Force that allows folks to come off the street as officer candidates to go through training to become part of the program. Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard all hire from within their enlisted ranks.
Except for the Coast Guard's last position that they just ran.
Well, that was an unusual thing. Yeah, they kind of broke that mold, didn't they?
Yeah, which was interesting. Wonderful. Sergeant Holton, you want to share a little bit of experience about being a musician in the band?
Yeah, so I've been in the Air Force for 8 years now, just coming up on 8 years. I started my first 5 years as a regional bandsman at the Air Force Academy Band, which is in Colorado Springs. And it was kind of a unique time being in that band because the band had just gone through what I guess we just call like a de-premiere. They used to be one of the special bands where you enter at an elevated rank and you stay at that one assignment for the duration of your career. But I think I was maybe the third airman, so lower ranking person to come in that building. So when I got there, it still very much had this premier special band type culture. Most of the players were still left over from the premier band, and slowly they were getting dispersed out into the career field to other regional bands. But I think even the entire 5 years that I was there, it kind of kept that sort of culture, high expectations of music, musician first, which I'm not at all saying that's what the other regional bands are not that. It was just it was rewarding for me because the brass quintet that I got assigned to was the same brass quintet that I would go to the Rafael Mendez Brass Institute and hear them headline and just be absolutely wowed. And now I was a trumpet player in there. So it was a really surreal and rewarding experience. Like I said, I served 5 years there, and throughout that time, if you're a regional bandsman, you are offered opportunities to audition for the premier band, which at the time, the only premier band in the Air Force is in Washington, D.C. And so I took a few auditions, and they kept having no hires, and eventually they hired 3 of us in one day. And about 6 months later, I moved to the Washington, D.C. area to be a part of the Air Force Band ceremonial brass. So the ceremonial brass has a really unique mission. It's pretty much it's nothing like what I spent years and years practicing my instrument preparing for. In fact, the audition is not really anything like the actual job you do. The audition that I took was very similar to an audition that you might take for a professional orchestra or a concert band, a military concert band. However, in the ceremonial brass, I'd say about 90% of my missions, the jobs that I play, the performances that I do, take place in Arlington National Cemetery, where I'm honoring our nation's heroes and honoring their family at their funerals. So, the part of the job that's really rewarding is that everything that I play is super important. It's a very important job. The downside of it is that the hardest thing that I play is 16 measures of a march and a hymn, which sometimes that's very difficult to play well if it's, 29, 30 degrees outside and you're trying to play in tune, in time, get good response. It's very difficult, but for different reasons than how playing a Mahler symphony in an audition or excerpt from that is, how that would be. So one other really nice thing about the job is that it allows a lot of time for professional development and to pursue other musical interests. Funerals happen mostly between the hours of 9 and the last one starts at 3 p.m. every day. We're typically only assigned to the morning or the afternoon, and we have another group that comes in. So it leaves a lot of time for me to, keep up my chops and play and find some maybe musical fulfillment. I get a lot of fulfillment from my job, but not necessarily always musical fulfillment, right? So that's where I've picked up kind of some conducting gigs that we can talk about a little bit later in the area, conducting some local groups, mostly at the community junior college level. But it's also allowed me other professional development opportunities. The Air Force, and I believe, Colonel could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that most areas of our military, as far as music ensembles, are very supportive of professional development. So through my time in the Air Force Band, I've been able to attend 2 or 3 conducting symposiums that I haven't paid a dime for. Not even my hotel, my travel, the Air Force has paid for, because it has helped me serve in my capacity as a drum major in the ceremonial brass. It's helped me that much more. So it's an investment that the Air Force and the Air Force Band has been willing to put in for me to do that. I've taken private lessons with, some of the best orchestral players in our country, live and through Zoom, and the Air Force has paid for that because it helps me do my job better. I've also been in places where I've given performances in locations that I never would have imagined before, or something that I never really would have aspired for. When we go to school, oftentimes we're thinking about, like, I'm going to play in this orchestra, and we're going to play this repertoire every year, and it's going to be this and that. And, I'm so fortunate that I just was so close-minded that I never thought about other opportunities that existed out there. For example, I probably played the national anthem or the 7th inning stretch at dozen or 2 dozen maybe professional sporting events. I've performed in the headline spot at the Midwest Clinic with the Air Force Band. I perform regularly in schools, especially around the DC area, as part of our educational outreach program. It's titled Innovation Through Music. So it's just been a wonderful opportunity. In addition, getting to conduct at times some of my colleagues, which as the Colonel kind of talked about a little bit, just world-class players, and me as a trumpet player that's taken an interest in conducting, being given these opportunities to conduct concert band, chamber groups, just because my commander saw that I had an interest in that, and that I was working hard at it, and that it was something that was important to me, and he was able to kind of leverage that and say, well, this would be great for the unit as well, as in addition to this one person. So I never I wasn't going to school to become a military musician, but it just so happened that it was the first job that I've won, but I couldn't imagine my life going a different direction. The service aspect of it is something, performing those military funerals, and has just been something that's been so rewarding that I could have never imagined as a young, aspiring professional trumpet player.
That's great, Adrian. Haley, can you hear me? Why don't we ask your question about being in the military and kind of the training and any sort of wartime stuff. Well, why don't you ask your question about that, and either of these gentlemen can answer.
My question was basically,
Haley, you're gonna have to get closer.
I'm sorry. My question is basically about, like, when you went into the military, did you have to go through, like, the basic training with the rest of people that entered the military? Like, if you would be called into, like, active duty, your job in the military, that's
So I'm not sure if you could hear that, but she was asking about going to basic training as a musician in the military, and kind of what your role would be if we were to go into an active war situation as a bandsman. And either of you, feel free to answer that.
Adrian, why don't you start?
Okay, so I'll speak just on the Air Force, because that's all I really know. I was hired as a musician. That was the audition that I took, the job that I auditioned for, and that's, the majority of what I do is either playing my instrument or functioning in some sort of alternate duty that's related to running a professional arts organization. So 99% of what I do is that I have had to pick some weeds off the flower beds at the front entrance of the building before the chief of staff of the Air Force came. I've had to do little things like that, but 99% I'm playing trumpet. But part of being in the military is, as you kind of alluded to, is kind of just being ready for anything. And so I did have to go to basic training. In fact, all military musicians go to some sort of a training, whether they're the officer or enlisted route, so conductor or player, with the exception of the President's Own Marine Band and the Coast Guard Band. I believe those are the only two exceptions to that. And so I went to, I think it was 8.5 weeks at that time of basic military training at Lackland Air Force Base, where I was there assigned with 60 other people into a squadron. Actually, I guess that would be a flight. We were in a flight that, and I was the only bandsman. I was the only person going in this very unique career field. So I did have to do that. And honestly, people ask like, oh, that's a barrier for me to go into a military music route. That's not something I want to go through. But to be honest, like if you've made it through any level of high school marching band or college marching band or music school, you have the mental strength and patience and leadership to really excel in that environment. So I was looking at it as this is 8 weeks of my life that I'm giving up for a wonderful career, which, as I've kind of outlined for you in that intro, it's absolutely been worth it. I mean, I would do it again. If there was a musical group that I really wanted to be in the military and it meant that I had to go through that other unit's basic training, I would probably consider doing it again. Because like I said, the downside is 8 weeks. I got in really good shape too. My wife was excited. And I have a great job on the other end. As far as in a wartime, so yeah, it's always possible that that I would get sent to do something. It's always a possibility, but it's never happened before. It's never happened, at least in modern history. There are bandsmen that are deployed to undisclosed locations in the Air Force 365 days a year. They're usually on a 3-month deployment cycle. And I was actually, before I moved over to the Premier Band, I was on a deployment team that was a few months away from being deployed to basically the Middle East. But when the Air Force deploys, and this may be different in other services, I'm not sure, we are there on a 100% musical mission. So we are performing for the troops that are in the area. So at the base where you're stationed, and then they also travel around to other bases. They're performing at embassies, assisting the State Department in diplomacy. And then they're also even getting out into the schools in these local areas. So whether that's in the United Arab Emirates, Afghanistan, wherever that may be, helping strengthen the relationship and the public perception of the United States being kind of, hunkered down in this area for the greater good, whatever you want to call that. And some of the stories I've heard from my friends that have deployed is those are some of the most impactful moments of their career. Just like I talked about my performances at Arlington National Cemetery, is being able to connect with these students and these kids that are in these kind of war-torn countries, and the positive impact that music can have that bombs and guns don't have, or may not have as effectively. And so I think that's a really important part. So to answer your question, yes, it's possible in the Air Force, and there are musicians deployed all the time. But I'm not trained to do that. I had 1 day of combat training. I've shot a rifle one time in my life, and that was the 1 day of basic training where I did that. So there's a lot of people that are more qualified to go to assist in that. But again, I'm there if it's absolutely needed.
And the Army parallels a lot of what the Air Force does. For the one difference I know for our enlisted musicians, well, we have the same hierarchy of special bands versus all the others. And basic training is the first thing. And then we do have the School of Music in Virginia Beach, Virginia, that is shared by Army, Navy, and Marines. And there are some basic courses of instruction as well as some advanced courses for both enlisted musicians as they get promoted, and for officers as well. So we do some of the basics of the instructional training, and it's pretty competitive now to audition for a place in any of the military bands. And when I was the commandant in charge of the Army School of Music, it's kind of like the dean. There was at least one student in each of our basic courses that was either ABD or had an earned doctorate. So a lot of folks simply are looking for a great outlet to continue playing and to play professionally. And that afforded them an opportunity to not only continue playing their instruments, but having an opportunity to have a job with benefits and a pretty decent sense of job security. For officers, basic training, officer candidate school, of which there are no guarantees in the Army of graduation. You have to earn it just like every other officer candidate, and then an officer training course in your area of specialty, which for us now is at the School of Music. When back in the dark ages I came through, I had to learn all the personnel functions because there was no separate training for musicians. It was very interesting. There are some of our bands who have deployed into war zones, and fortunately they are also strictly doing music. In the early years that was not so true, but like you heard from Sergeant Holton, we serve at the pleasure of our bosses. The title that the Army likes to use is soldier musician, because we don't want the rest of the military looking at us and saying, oh, they're just in the band. And it was fun in the early years. We were very competitive in intramural athletics, and there was nothing worse for the MPs to get beat at softball or basketball or most anything by the band. And what they don't understand is the band, we all know what music does for basic levels of intelligence. Smart people. And in the Army, the average intelligence that is tested in the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, the ASVAB test that everybody needs to take before you come in, shows that the military musicians have amongst the highest average IQs in the military. And so musicians are smart. And then there are a lot of people that were also athletes and are very competitive. So it's fun to own up to that fact that we say soldier musician, because you have to have that basic grounding of experience to be a soldier, and then employ your specialty, which is as musician. So when the plane hit the Pentagon back in that fateful September 11th day, it was the Army band that scrambled to go and handle the access points for anybody going into the site at the Pentagon. The flag that was draped over the side of the building came from the Army band. It usually dropped at the end of concerts when we played Stars and Stripes. Same thing happened with the band up at West Point in terms of helping control gates. So, things that need doing, the bandsmen can do as well, but that's not their normal job. And, 99% of what they do is exactly what Sergeant Holton said, is working on music, working on individual practice, working on professional development. The same opportunities, I think, are consistent across the board in helping individuals meet their potential and grow beyond the specifics of their current job. just like standing in front of a ceremonial band as drum major and conducting your peers. It's an awesome thing. So there are opportunities. I tell you, when we were going through officer candidate school down at Fort Benning, Georgia, you know, some of the folks who had been prior enlisted looked up at the parachute towers where they trained folks to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, and kind of wishing they would be anywhere but where they were. But walking through all of that process of breaking down the individual and building back a team player brought us to a point of confidence that we felt we could do absolutely anything. So it was a really rewarding experience, not necessarily fun all the time, but it really helped individuals with a sense of confidence and also leadership. And I think we were all better for the training.
Colonel, why don't we start with you and kind of illuminate your process about score study, you know, especially in your position with Pershing Zone. You had a lot of concerts that were back-to-back with different repertoire, and maybe you can help share your perspective on that.
Well, I don't think there are any real shortcuts for swallowing scores. The advantage I had in working with professionals is I had certain expectations of not having to do a deep dive harmonic analysis. If there were some sections that were a little more complex, you know, bitonal, polytonal, I might have to find out which choirs have the triads and listen and balance and just have an understanding. But for me, it's always about the macro picture. In a linear fashion, where are the high points? Every phrase has a goal. And where does that goal fit within the structure of the whole piece? And I'm really thinking musical goal, be it dynamic, maybe tempo, if there's a give and take, if it's more of an expressive piece. But what do I need to do or know or understand about this particular piece of music to help the musicians grasp the concept as quickly as we can? You know, I mean, the whole thing is you're not there to learn your notes, you're there to learn everybody else's notes. So how can I show that process in a quick manner? And so I'm always looking for those kinds of shortcuts. My scores are not very heavily marked. I just came back from the Honor Band of America, and we did Esprit de Corps was one. And I have to go about 2 or 3 pages in before I see the first indication of, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but I put a couple of little pencil marks in front of sections who I really wanted to focus on. And because I have old eyes, I might say TPT for trumpet and make it a little bit bigger, just like I have to write numbers on measures so I know that I can glance quickly and indicate where it is that we're going to start from. But for me, I will start with the macro picture and look and see what the piece is going to do, which is the highest dynamic plateau. And how can I make sure that every other plateau achieves a direction towards that point? And if we achieve a dynamic plateau of fortissimo, mostly it's unrealistic to sustain a fortissimo. So what do I need to tell them? Arrive fortissimo, the very next note that you play, drop back to forte, so that you can continue to grow or continue to express the phrase musically as you move forward, because every note comes from someplace or goes to someplace. How do I help reinforce the idea of direction? You know, which of these phrases needs some kind of indication? These groups of 4/16 notes, can you crescendo each of those groups of 4/16 notes so that the second note is louder than the first, rather than taga-daga-da, it's shaka-daga-da. so I look for the musical concepts that I need to emphasize with the musicians. And for me, it's repetition. I don't necessarily practice conducting, but I hear the piece, I study the piece, and if it's brand new to me or if it's a premiere, then I'll break it down and go line by line so that I know what each section is facing, each person is facing, and maybe adapt the piece to the particular instrumentation. If there's 2 oboe and English horn parts and I only have 2, so what do we need to do? With the Maryland Winds professional group that I started 2 years ago after I retired, we play with fewer folks, 2 flutes and a piccolo. So there's some divisis and there's some choices to make. So then I dig down into the details by following each of the lines and understanding their challenges and hopefully anticipating questions, or maybe even putting out some information in advance to help shortchange any questions. So in terms of the study, there's just no replacement, no substitute for putting in the time with the score and understanding it. I'll listen to examples that might be out there initially, so I get an understanding of what some folks have done, but I don't generally circle back to recordings unless they're mine in rehearsal, so I can see what I've missed with my live ears when I go back and listen to recordings.
Adrian?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I quickly prepare any music. All of my preparation is extremely time intensive, and it's meticulous. I actually chart all of my pieces. It's kind of a recent thing. Within the past year, I started doing that. Similarly to what you guys discussed, I watched yesterday's class. So similarly to what you discussed yesterday, the system developed by Robert Garofalo. I think I actually sent, well, we can get to that in a second. I think a lot of the reason that I do that is because, I don't have the vast experience that Colonel Holton has. All the music that I'm conducting, I may be really familiar with as a player, but it's very likely that I'm conducting it for the very first time. And so for that reason, both a balanced system of charting and then also spending time in the score, developing these kind of musical concepts and ideas about phrasing and direction, things you just heard, I'm kind of balancing that. And I would say that this charting type stuff that I do way out in advance. I do it maybe months in advance from when I'm going to conduct the piece. Summers are a good time for that, when you don't have a lot of performances, depending on the calendar of your group. I find that the chart is real. I used to make all these notes that you see in this chart. I used to make those in the score. I'd even go through, I did O Magnum Mysterium, and I have every chord and every suspension identified in the score. But what I realized doing that is that I was missing, it was a lot of really great information, but I was missing a lot of key information that my players needed. And because my score was so muddied, I couldn't communicate those things. Like, I would like this line played this way, as though it's, you're inside of a glass box and they can just barely hear you. It's so transparent that they can just barely. I couldn't read that in my score. I couldn't show those gestures to get my players to play that way, because I had, C minor 7 goes to F major to, whatever. So that's why I switched over to this kind of charting system. You talked about it a lot yesterday, so I won't spend too much time there. But, regarding the rehearsal structure, I've actually found that this charting has helped with expediting or me teaching music to my groups a little faster. The 2 groups that I work with, I'm the music director of basically a community band called National Concert Band of America. So most of the people in there are, they have full-time jobs doing something else other than music. I do have maybe 6 or 7 premier bandsmen that maybe play in the ceremonial units of their groups that play in there. So it's a really strong community band that I've enjoyed working with. I also work with a band up in Maryland called the Maryland Band Directors Band. It's through Montgomery College. And that group is mostly music educators. So they have full-time jobs teaching music, but then we get together for 3 rehearsals, 3 Wednesday rehearsals and a Thursday concert. So it's a lot of music to get to them in 3 rehearsals that are spaced out awkwardly. And what I found is this was completely organic. That if you want to pull it up, I see it in the chat there, that 4 Scottish dances, I went through and identified things like melodies and counter melodies. And I realized that there was a lot of repetition there. This is something I probably could have found if I would have just been marking inside my score, but the fact that it's laid out so clearly, the first rehearsal, actually I opened up my 4 Scottish Dances score yesterday, and on the first page, I still have my sticky note from the first rehearsal here that basically identifies melody 1, when it happens. So it happens the opening to measure 8, it happens at letter B again, letter D, and letter E. It's a very repetitive movement. So I actually started my rehearsal with this group, with National Concert of America, saying, "Hey, this is what melody 1 is. This is where you might have it. If you have it, let's just play it together." So that way, I didn't have to go through each section, letter A, and then talk about how I want that melody shaped and how I want this melody shaped, and so on and so forth. And I rehearsed the melody, counter melody 1, counter melody 2, and then we finally went through and rehearsed the piece. And I mean, I was completely surprised, but I think we could have done a performance of the piece that night. I mean, we spent 40 minutes or so on that one movement, but the charting informed me that of how to rehearse it. And that doesn't always happen so seamlessly like that, but it's something that I've stumbled on, and I've bought in to that. Yeah, so like I said, just to kind of sum up that part of it, the analysis for me is just absolutely crucial. The last thing I'll add to that is what I found is, coming into these rehearsals with, all this knowledge of composer intent, of the structure of the piece, my players notice that. And I notice that as a trumpet player when the conductor's on the podium and they're, it's apparent when they really know the score. And it inspires me as a player to practice more when I see that the person on the podium is as prepared as I am. And I've noticed a lot of people in my group, they come up to be like, "Gosh, you really seem to know the scores." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do." And it's not like, if they said, "Oh, you're a beautiful conductor," which no one's ever said, "You're a beautiful conductor." I was like, "Yeah, I am." It's a completely different thing. It's like I've done the work that's required to be a music director standing on the podium. I know the score, and I'm able to guide you as players through this, assuming that you've also done your cursory work. So I found that it's served me really well to one, just show up prepared. But my group is noticing that, and they're coming in more and more prepared each rehearsal.
That's great, Adrian. Either of you can answer this question, or both. But in your process of score study, how do you ingrain that in your mind? Do you do it through audiation, or singing, or playing it on your instrument? What works best for you, Colonel?
I have a really bad habit of vocalizing when I'm on the podium. And the vocal teacher that my wife takes great exception to that. And it also, if I'm doing an honor band or something like that, I'll get hoarse pretty quickly because I do a lot of vocalization. But I think it's internal. I sing, I vocalize, I might even simply do the rhythms rather than all the melodics. I rarely go to the piano. I rarely go to my trombone. It's mostly sitting at the desk.
Yeah, same. I feel like I do a lot of listening to pieces, recordings, before I've decided that I'm going to start studying this and I'm going to conduct this. So honestly, like a lot of the music that, like, as I choose a program, I've listened to that program so many times because I'm tweaking, well, does this piece work with this one? How does this work at this section of the concert? Should this be later? And I spend a lot of time doing that. So by the time I've ordered the scores and they show up and I'm looking, I have a pretty good idea of how the piece goes. Now there's always like those inner lines, and yeah, I don't go to the piano a lot. I'll oftentimes just try to sing it or maybe play out if there's a couple of intervals that are difficult, I'll play them on the trumpet. But most of the time, yeah, I've got the melodic part in my head, and then through my analysis, I'm able to figure out who has what function in the chord or how the harmony is kind of informing the melody or vice versa. But yeah, most of it is, I've just listened to it a lot beforehand, which is probably, maybe it's not serving me super well, but it's stuff that I have to do because like I said, I'm conducting, for me, new music all the time. So I need to really be careful about how I'm choosing it. So it requires me to kind of listen to it a lot. I am also listening to all of my rehearsal recordings. I record every single rehearsal, audio and video, and I'll listen to it twice. I'll first just listen to the audio to help how I can craft the next rehearsal, what the players need. And then if I have time later in the week, I will go through and watch the video also, which is to make sure that now these things that I'm hearing, am I helping them with that, or am I hurting with that? So which sometimes happens. Sometimes you're like, wow, this is not going the way that I want, and it's possible that I'm a big part of that. So so I am hearing the piece then. So it's that's I think I'm getting all the information as far as melody and harmony those ways.
Great. So we have about 3 minutes left. There's a number of questions that they submitted for this session, but I think a lot of them have already been answered. But perhaps you have a different question after some of the things that have been brought up this morning. Any students have any questions, or our guest teachers have any questions about maybe the military career, or maybe something in score study or something? Sarah Faltz?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how much do you incorporate like solo music into your everyday playing along with like playing in the bands?
How much do we program solo music,
Uh,
or
I just on your own, like practicing and learning new pieces for your solo instruments.
Oh,
hmm,
well, that's my primary job in the Air Force as a player. So I'm always working on that. I've also, I've taken some auditions for conductor positions and jobs, and I think I've decided for me, this is just totally personal for me, that it's really important that I play my instrument because on a regular basis, because it helps me as a conductor a lot. There have been times where I've gone through where I'm just doing kind of the bare minimum, just maintenance to get by, because I've been busy with conducting engagements or family engagements, things like that. And for me, it's really important to challenge myself as a player. It makes my ears better. It makes me better on the podium. It makes me more empathetic too when I'm in my ensembles, when I'm addressing sections that are struggling with something. I can easily relate to it because I have had or I'm having that same struggle in my playing. So for me, it's super important. But again, that could be due to the fact that my primary job, my primary source of income is as a trumpet player.
and I'd like to echo the importance in being able to serve as a model. When I was teaching, I played in the local symphony, I played in a big band, I played in a brass quintet, and at church, and the students notice that, you're still gaining enjoyment as a player, whether it be I'll play a Palm Sunday solo in church, but not many of my kids were necessarily there to see it. But I think it really does help you view what it's like to be on the other side of the stand from me as a conductor versus me as a player. And that empathy, as Sergeant Holt mentioned, is really important because people will want to play for you if you are grateful for what they are doing in their ensemble contributions. And there's nothing worse than standing in front of an ensemble. You got a bunch of people that don't want to be there. Nothing. So your joy of music, I think, comes through in many ways, and continuing to play is one of them.
Any other questions? All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you both very much for your time. We really appreciate it. I thought it was a fascinating discussion about the military and sharing your perspective about score study. And we thank you so much. It helps us with a bunch of different perspective during this time, which is a great opportunity for us to learn additional insight. So thank you so much. A little silent applause, which is a little odd, but we really appreciate it and hope you are all well and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Colonel. I enjoyed hearing your insight.
Likewise. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.